translates, somewhat unfairly, to Joanna the Mad. Why mad? Well, she was deeply emotional, prone to jealousy, and when her husband died, she allegedly slept beside his corpse for months. Not the healthiest coping mechanism, but grief is rarely tidy. Their children, though, became the next links in the Habsburg chain. One of those children, Charles V, ended up ruling an empire so vast that it was said the sun never set on it. He was intelligent, ambitious, and also the proud carrier of a jawline so distinctive it eventually became its own medical term, the Habsburg jaw. Yes, the dynasty actually left a mark on medical textbooks. That's commitment. The more the family married into itself, the more noticeable the jaw became. Protruding lower lips, difficulty chewing, and sometimes speech issues. But to the Habsburgs, this was the cost of keeping the throne in the family, and by the time we reach the 17th century, that cost becomes very, very obvious. Enter Charles II of Spain. He was nicknamed El Hechizado, or the Bewitched. Which sounds like the title of a romantic comedy, but in Charles's case, it was more of a collective shrug from his subjects who simply could not explain why their king was so frail. Charles was the product of generations of Habsburg inbreeding. His family tree looked less like a tree and more like a very determined vine twisting back onto itself. By the time he was born, his parents were uncle and niece. Which, medically speaking, is not ideal. The results? Charles was sickly from the start. He didn't walk until he was 4. Didn't speak until he was nearly 8. His jaw was so deformed he could barely chew his food. His health was a carousel of seizures, infections, and mysterious ailments. And yet, he was king. Because of course he was. Now, imagine being a subject of Spain at this time. Your king is supposed to be the figure of strength, stability, and leadership. Instead, you have Charles, a man who could barely rule his own body, let alone an empire. Ministers and nobles ruled in his name, while Charles drifted, often confused, occasionally paranoid, and always at the mercy of those around him. He married twice. Both marriages were politically arranged, naturally. Both wives failed to produce children. Which, when you looked at Charles's fragile health, was less a surprise and more a biological certainty, and with his death in 1700, childless and broken, the Spanish branch of the Habsburg dynasty came to an end. The great royal house that had once ruled across continents essentially collapsed under the weight of its own genetic recycling. You could almost call it poetic. Or tragic. Or maybe just predictable. Let's drift gently onward. We've spent a while in the candlelit halls of the Habsburgs, watching their family tree fold in on itself like an unfortunate piece of origami. But of course, they weren't alone in this particular hobby. Other dynasties across Europe looked at the Habsburg strategy and thought, yes, let's do exactly the same thing. Because naturally, they did take the French Bourbons, for instance. Stylish, extravagant, lovers of court intrigue and silk stockings. But also, keen on marrying cousins, the Bourbons rose to prominence in the 16th century, eventually producing perhaps the most famous of them all, Louis XIV, the Sun King. He reigned for 72 years, which is impressive, though perhaps not quite as impressive as the wigs he managed to balance on his head. Now, Louis himself didn't suffer terribly from inbreeding. His jawline was, mercifully, fairly standard. But the family line had already tangled itself in enough cousinly embraces that by the time you get to the later Bourbons, health problems begin to quietly creep in. Hemophilia, fragile infants, and sudden child deaths haunted their nurseries. Royal cradles, in this era, were lined not just with lace but with anxiety. Because for every prince born, there was a frighteningly high chance he wouldn't live long enough to wear a crown. Let's pause with Louis XIV himself. Imagine Versailles, chandeliers dripping light, mirrored halls stretching endlessly, fountains spraying into the air with theatrical wastefulness. Louis built a palace so vast that its corridors alone could swallow small towns. He styled himself the Sun King because, naturally, everything revolved around him, but even the Sun King wasn't above the dynastic marriage game. His brother married within the family. His relatives across Europe were tied into the same intricate web. By the time you looked at a map, you realized that nearly every royal household in Europe was, in some way, a Bourbon cousin, a Habsburg cousin, or a Valois cousin. Which explains a lot. Let's drift to the Valois dynasty in France. They were, if anything, even more dysfunctional. The Valois court of the 16th century was a theater of chaos, ambitious queens, suspicious brothers, and marriages that stitched together relatives with more enthusiasm than common sense. One queen in particular, Catherine de Medici, spent her career marrying off children like chess pieces. She wasn't picky about bloodlines. She was Italian, and her dynasty was ambitious. But the royal families she tied herself to were already thick with shared ancestry. Her daughters and sons inherited not only thrones but fragile constitutions and nervous dispositions. The irony was thick. These marriages were meant to strengthen kingdoms. In reality, they often weakened the very people who were supposed to lead them. Across the Channel, the English royals were no strangers to this pattern either. The Tudors, yes, Henry VIII with his 6 wives, were slightly better at avoiding immediate cousin marriages, but not entirely innocent. Mary I of England married Philip II of Spain, who, as you might recall, was pure-blood Habsburg stock. So once again, the English crown tapped right into that same genetic spiral. The result? No children, and a legacy of frustration. Elizabeth I, of course, famously never married at all. Perhaps she saw enough sickly royal children around Europe to decide, wisely, that solitude might be healthier than yet another cousin. Let's drift northward, softly, to the Scandinavian courts. Even in Chile, Denmark and Sweden, cousin marriage was the fashionable way to keep crowns in safe hands. The problem was, safe hands don't always mean steady hands. Danish kings struggled with bouts of madness, fragile health, and in one case, alcoholism so profound it was whispered about across the Baltic. The crown jewels may have sparkled, but behind the glitter, there were plenty of nervous doctors pacing palace corridors. And now, let's drift gently back to Spain. Because while the Bourbons eventually replaced the Habsburgs there, the problems didn't vanish overnight. In fact, when Philip V of Spain, the very first Bourbon king in Madrid, took the throne, he inherited more than just power. He inherited a legacy of nervous breakdowns. Philip V was, by many accounts, deeply unstable. He suffered from depression, paranoia, and bouts of what modern historians might call bipolar disorder. He would lie in bed for days, refusing to see anyone, insisting he was dead, or that his body was rotting. His wife had to coax him out of bed just to perform the simplest royal duties. So yes, the dynasty had technically changed from Habsburg to Bourbon, but the family tree was still tangled enough that the inheritance included fragile minds as well as crowns. Let's pause here, just to notice something. When royal families kept marrying their cousins, they weren't simply preserving bloodlines. They were preserving the same problems, over and over. Fragile infants. Nervous monarchs. Jaws that refused to close properly. It's almost like history was whispering to them, softly, maybe stop doing this. But of course, they didn't, because dynastic pride is louder than genetics. And thrones, once claimed, are very difficult to let go of. Pampering came tantrums. Royal children were not exactly taught humility. There's a famous story about young Louis XIV of France, the so-called Sun King, who once threw a fit so spectacular that it involved throwing his little shoes at a servant. Naturally, no one dared scold him. When you're destined to become the absolute monarch of France, even your tantrums are treated like state matters. Let's not forget the darker side of this indulgence, because behind the nursery walls was the constant specter of mortality. Infant mortality rates among royals were shockingly high, despite the silks and prayers. Smallpox, measles, plague, they didn't care if you were wearing ermine. Royal parents buried child after child, sometimes before the baby was even named. And each death wasn't just a personal loss, it was a dynastic crisis. Behind every tiny coffin was the whisper of instability. Childhood for royals was a strange paradox. Too much attention, yet not enough freedom. Surrounded by wealth, yet stalked by weakness. Loved, perhaps, but always as a symbol rather than a person. The little boy in the gilded cradle was less a child, and more a placeholder for the future crown. Let's drift gently now, away from the crying nurseries and drafty halls, toward another angle of royal oddity, the marriages that awaited these fragile, spoiled, and often sickly children. Because if you think their early years were strange, just wait until you hear what happened when they were sent into arranged unions, sometimes as young as 12. But we'll ease into that in just a moment. Few had the luxury of genuine happiness. And the children that followed? Well, they often carried the visible reminders of centuries of bad matchmaking. Fragile bones, nervous dispositions, and faces that betrayed the Habsburg jaw from a mile away. Let's not forget the tragicomic irony of it all. These marriages were designed to strengthen empires, yet they often weakened the very foundations they were supposed to secure. The fall of the Spanish Habsburgs, the instability of the French crown, the crises of succession in England, all tied back to unions that cared more about politics than biology. So, as we drift toward the close of tonight's long, quiet ramble, let's take a moment to picture it, a medieval wedding feast. Long tables lined with roasted meats, goblets of wine, and music played on lutes. A bride barely old enough to wear her crown, a groom who looks suspiciously like her cousin, and courtiers whispering about alliances while pretending to smile. Behind the laughter and pageantry lies the weight of dynasties, the fragility of bloodlines, and the quiet knowledge that this marriage is less about two people and more about the survival, or collapse, of kingdoms. And now, as the candles burn low in that imagined hall, we can let the noise of history fade into a gentle hush. Tonight, we've wandered through royal nurseries, fragile childhoods, tantrums, sickbeds, and disastrous marriages. Each story a reminder that behind the crowns and the jewels, these were just people, fallible, fragile, and often deeply unlucky in their family arrangements. So let your eyes grow heavy, your breath slow and steady, and drift into sleep. Because if there's one lesson history whispers softly, it's that even kings and queens could not escape the pull of time, chance, and genetics. And with that, good night.